Well, bore da bawb, a diolch yn fawr am y croeso. It's lovely to be back in the Garw Valley. I'm a bit distant from the microphone, but I'm hoping that the resonant tones are reaching the back of the hall. Yes? Happy? Very good. And if the police community officers at the back are nodding, I'm very happy. Okay? Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to have such a good crowd here, and some distinguished guests and some familiar faces for me from my frequent visits to the Garw, and it's always good to have such a warm welcome. There are lots of reasons, Huw, and we'll come to talk about one of the main ones, lots of reasons to like the Garw Valley. My grandmother spent all her life here, so that's number one reason. Number two reason, my mum's spent quite a bit of her life here. And number three reason is that Richard Price was born here. Okay, so if you put all those together, it's not a bad little mix for me personally. And I'm going to prove to you how old I am, because in 1973, my auntie Iona from Llangeinor brought my sister and me to swim in the brand new swimming pool that had just opened across the road, just over there. Okay, and every time I pass, I remember that. And I know it's difficult to believe, but I am 60, even though I look 37. No, it's absolutely true. Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. So, we want to talk about something rather special. The fact that you, as a community, have ownership and have a great stake in one of the great figures in world thinking. Not just a great Welshman, which he certainly was, but a great global figure. Not many communities can lay claim to that. So the whole point of this celebration, because it is that, is to tell the rest of the world about Richard Price, where he came from, what he did, what he achieved. Why are we so obsessed with him? Well, we're obsessed with him because A, we feel his story hasn't been told clearly enough, and B, because we think he's something worth shouting about. And Huw Edwards said very eloquently there that it's somebody who shook the foundations of the way we think about the world, and somebody who was way ahead of his time. At a time of great belief in the divine right of monarchs, here's somebody who thought about equality, who thought that the principles of the French Revolution, not the violent bits, but the principles of it, were worthy principles. Somebody who thought that the American colonies, as they then were, the states, were quite right to look for independence. These were very unpopular views, but he was ahead of his time. And that's why I think we respect him and admire him. Dr. Huw Williams from the Philosophy Department at Cardiff University is, in every sense of the word, an expert on Richard Price. And what I thought we'd do, Huw, if you're happy, is to have a little chat about Richard Price, the local man, the Welshman, and then maybe Richard Price, the international figure, and then maybe I'll ask you a few questions about the relevance of Richard Price and his thought today. Which bits of his thinking are still of value to us, and which bits maybe are ones that we should be discarding, if any. Okay, that'll take us to about 3 o'clock this afternoon, and then we'll wrap it up by 5. Okay, so, no, we're going to do 15-20 minutes at the most. Okay, so just to have a sense of where we are, and I'm delighted. Croeso mawr I ti. Diolch yn fawr ti am ddod. Are we right to call Richard Price a great Welshman, given that, yes, he was born here, but spent most of his life away from here, and is known these days as more of a global figure than a Welsh figure? What kind of Welshman was he?
Yeah, it's a very good question, isn't it? And one I suppose that you would be understanding of as, London Welsh, or part of the London Welsh community yourself. But I don't suppose the fact that you spent most of your life now in London means that you feel any less Welsh, or that you feel anything that you do out there in the world, the values you project, the ideas you discuss, it doesn't come from anywhere different. The fact that you've left Wales, that stays with you, and I think it's obviously a fact that we're all familiar with, that the place that you're born, the place that you're brought up, really does impact you in terms of your values and the way you view the world. Whether that means you necessarily always carry those values with you is, you know, an open-ended thing, because often we sort of rebel, don't we, and we want to push back against some of the values that we inherit. But I think with Richard Price, without doubt, you know, he was, what, 17 when he went down to London? So I think arguably you can say in terms of his horizons and his values, they would have been certainly very mature even at that point. He, of course, went to the dissenting schools in South Wales. So he was in Neath, he was over in Pentwyn, close to Crosshands, and then his dad sent him up to Talgarth because his dad wasn't too happy about some of the radical ideas he was being exposed to over in the Wild West. So he then went up to Talgarth, and those are the three schools where he, you know, learnt his trade, if you like. He obviously would have been discussing theology, and theology from that Welsh non-conformist perspective. He would have been doing his mathematics, his science, and all that, I would argue, would have laid the basis for him then. So he moved down to London when he was 17. Obviously, his father had passed away. He made sure that his mother and his sisters were well looked after, that they moved down to Bridgend. His mother tragically died, and at that point you can sort of understand this young, bright individual who obviously had ambitions, thinking, well, you know, I want to make my way in the world. My parents are no longer with me. And you can see him going down to London, and there he was looked after by his uncle. He was taken in by a chap called George Streatham, who basically employed Price. And that was the early period when he really started, I suppose, to take the values and ideas that he'd learnt back in Wales with him, and he became part of the discussions and, all the ferment of the day, if you like. And that's where he started writing his first work in philosophy. So he was born 1723, would have been down in London by 1740. In the next 10, 15 years, he became part of all that cutting-edge discussion, if you like. And then he published in 1758 his work on moral philosophy, and that's when he became a sort of big household name, if you like, if you had such a thing in that period. But I would say again, you know, in terms of those moral ideas he set out there, those would have been deeply influenced by his earlier education, his experiences here in Wales, and that then laid the foundation for all the amazing discussions and all the amazing pieces that he wrote about politics later in his life.
You mentioned the London Welsh community. Of course, in the mid-18th century, there were quite a few London Welsh congregations, some worshipping in Welsh, some not, some in dissenting congregations, some in Anglican churches. Is there any evidence that he dealt with those, had dealings with those, or did he plough his own furrow from the start?
If you look at the history of Price, as it's perhaps best conveyed to us by Paul Frame, who's a recent biographer of Price, and I don't think I've seen Paul here this morning actually, so it's just an opportunity to thank him really for all the incredible work that he's done. He published a biography in 2016, I think. Liberty's Apostle, fantastic book, and really perhaps one of the reasons that we're here, and I know Vic has a deep debt to Paul in terms of telling his story in such detail. And it is actually notable really and interesting that with his employment with the Streatham family, that he seems to have gone into a different world than a lot of his contemporaries in London at that time from Wales. And it's interesting as well, if you think of other figures from that time, I suppose Iolo Morgannwg might be the most famous of the London Welsh, who seemed to turn in very different circles where there was actually a much, if you like, deeper conversation and connection back to events in Wales. With Price, he's obviously involved, but in a sort of peripheral way. The same is true actually of the way in which he, kept his connection with Wales, because as we know, he would go back every year. He'd always ensure that he'd come back to Wales. He was very proud of where he came from. He was always, keen to sort of extol the virtues of his community in Wales to his friends, people like Benjamin Franklin and so on. He'd come back and he'd go and do his, you mentioned swimming. He'd go down to Southern Down every year to do his sea swimming. Price was a real physical, if not physical specimen. He enjoyed his physical exercise. But it's that connection, I think, with Wales that is both peripheral but also important to who he was, because although he turned in different circles, we might say, down in London, he still kept that connection, and he still, you know, brought those ideas, those conversations back here to Wales. He was in Wales when the French Revolution broke in 1789, which of itself tells you a story. And, you know, if you read, say, a historian like Huw Williams, for example, he makes deep connections between what was happening in London, amongst also the London Welsh community, and what was just starting to sort of fizzle away here in Wales. So if you look at, you know, Merthyr, the Merthyr Rising in 1832, is it? Somebody like Huw Williams would say, well, people like Price actually set the tone for those sort of developments, that you had these intellectuals who were, you know, discussing within chapel, within the broader context, and that in many ways bringing those ideas back from London was what helped to set off a lot of the subsequent ideas and incidents and political developments here in Wales. So, you know, for me, Price is one of those figures who he anticipates what's going to happen in Wales in the 19th century. You say ahead of his time, absolutely. But then within 30, 40 years, a lot of the ideals that Price had really became a reality here in the south of Wales, perhaps before many other parts of the world, to be honest.
If we translate some of this then to a British and then a global international stage, given his ties with America as well at the time of the independence war in the States, let's think about Price as a figure on a world stage. We talk about him as a mathematician. We talk about him as somebody who laid the foundations of actuarial finance and insurance. He rewrote the rules for that. A philosopher, a theologian, a minister stroke preacher. All of these things, in his own way, of course, not a politician, but a political thinker. Where does he make the biggest mark on the world stage with all of those things? Is it because of his dealings with Jefferson and Franklin and, you know, the big American founding fathers? Or is it to do with his thoughts on philosophy and equality and the rights of women and, you know, the ideas that he had, which were, frankly, to lots of people, offensive because of the world they lived in? His anti-royalist sentiments, which were all based on the fact that we should all have equal rights. Where did he make his biggest mark?
Well, that's an easy question for you to put to me, Huw. Thank you. I mean, I think that's the fascination with Price, isn't it? The wonder of Price, in a sense, that he had this wide array of talents that he developed in so many different directions. And in some ways, I look at him and I think, you know, if he'd have stuck with philosophy, you know, he would have been up there with the greats. So we talk about figures like Immanuel Kant, for example, from the 18th century, who in my field just, you know, dominate because they left such a legacy. And Price, with many of his ideas, is very similar to Kant, has a very similar worldview. But with Price, it's almost like he had this project, he wanted to make his contribution, and then he wanted to move on. And so I'm convinced that had he stuck with philosophy, we would probably be discussing him side by side with Kant as one of the biggest influences. But that wasn't who he was, you know. And, you know, going back to his upbringing and his characteristics, there seems to be this sort of energy, and I wonder if that sort of dissenting background, that background of being somebody who was always, if you like, engaged in the world around him, always drove him on to then do something else, do something new. Because I'm looking at this from a, you know, perspective of philosophy and thinking, why is this guy doing insurance, you know? What a weird thing to be doing if you're a philosopher, you know, I'll do a bit of insurance in my spare time. But then if you put it in the context of this individual who was obviously incredibly driven to make the world a better place, as he was saying, you know, shake the foundations. It wasn't enough to sit in his, you know, comfy chair and talk about philosophy and, you know, publish a few things. He wanted to be out there doing things. And so, in a way, that sort of, if you like, intellectual, philosophical background gave him his stature. People knew they were dealing with the real deal, if you like. But that then gave him a platform to explore other areas. And so when we're talking about insurance, he wrote on the national debt, you know, Bayes' theorem, which is the basis for probability theory, that's the basis for, you know, the internet and artificial intelligence. You know, Price did all that. And I think it's that accumulation, perhaps, that makes him such a great and global figure. And interestingly enough, when we talk about his friendship with Benjamin Franklin, it wasn't his political work that first made Franklin say this guy is a world leader. It was actually his work on the national debt.
Right.
You know, Franklin said of that text, this is one of the greatest contributions, intellectual contributions of the 18th century. And that was one of the reasons he came to the attention of the Americans. It wasn't just his support for their cause, it was what he was doing in terms of, you know, laying the foundations for a modern society. So when Price then in 1776, you wrote the very famous tract called Observations on Civil Liberty, that was coming out in support of the Americans and saying, you know, there is an obvious moral case for why we should let the Americans, you know, run themselves, as it were. That, in a way, cemented his relationship with the Americans. But it was that combination of the practical elements of his work that was sort of universal in their application, as well as his support then for all the progressive causes of the time, that really, I think, gave him that stature. And, you know, just to close with a couple of things on these thoughts, there's a couple of incidents, if you like, that give us a sense of, Price's global stature. They invited him in 1778 to come over to the States, because essentially they wanted him to be their Chancellor of the Exchequer. They wanted him to sort the finances of the new America because of this work that he'd been doing around the national debt and all his expertise in finance. He refused. There's debate as to why that happened. I know in Vic's play that, there's a couple of scenes around why was it that Price never took that leap over to the Americas. But then subsequently, even though he'd sort of turned them down, in 1781 then, Yale University offered him a doctorate, a sort of honorary degree, along with one other person. You probably know who that person was, George Washington. So that just gives you a sense of who Price was and his stature at that time, that the Americans wanted him there to help them create this new nation state. When he didn't come over, they still offered him an honorary doctorate and said, you're right up there with Washington. Incredible, really, incredible.
You've touched on this a few times, just in terms of some of these themes, but just to think then about relevance today, because I'm really impressed. The work that the children have done, actually, on the display fantastic. There. I mean, the display as a whole, can I say, is very impressive. Okay, it's really well done. So congratulations to everyone who's been involved in that. I especially like the children's contribution because there's an energy about it which is great, and I absolutely applaud what Huw Edwards was saying, to give schools and teachers the freedom within a curriculum to explore local themes in terms of Price, but of course, as we've now established, he's much more than a local theme, is a very, very good thing. It's a bit of a scandal, really, that Richard Price hasn't been on Welsh school curriculums for the last 50, 60, 70 years. But okay, we are where we are, and it's changing, and that's great. So for me, it's to do with why children today would think that Price is relevant. How do they understand? How can they understand what his contribution is in terms of the way we live today and the way we think about how we govern ourselves? What kind of government do we want? What is our approach to national debt? Because actually, as we all know in this room, concepts of debt can be used to justify all kinds of policies. Yeah. Concepts of debt can be used to say we can't pay for this and we can't pay for that. And suddenly there is money available to pay for other things. Okay, so the whole notion of debt, and when is debt bad and when is debt not bad, all of these concepts that are crucial to us today. So for young children especially, trying to think about how the world works, where does Price fit into this picture? How can he best be understood today?
Another easy question there, if you don't mind my mention. I like just to reiterate what you said about the displays. Really fantastic. Such a lot of work's gone into it, and I had the pleasure of going up to the school and spending a little time with the children there, and it was so fantastic to see their enthusiasm, and it's wonderful to see the work that they've been doing, and I know that work's going to continue after half term as well. So it's fantastic to see that they've been so inspired. I mean, we touched on a lot of themes when I was up there, as you'd expect, you know, discussing Richard Price. But one of the more interesting and revealing conversations was when we started to discuss his politics and his emphasis on, you know, civil society and community. And I noticed that part of the display discusses, you know, their ideal society. And I think maybe that's a really important jumping off point or starting point for the discussion of Price and who he was for our young people, especially in the context of politics, and as Huw was saying, you know, wanting to enthuse young people and tell them that they can go out there and change the world. And for me, it's the later work by Price, actually, when he supported, as you said, the sort of opening events of the French Revolution. He wrote a short piece called A Discourse on the Love of Our Country, and I think that's a fantastic piece in terms of understanding the man, understanding his politics, his view of the world. Because what he tells us is, you know, it's right and proper to love your country. You know, patriotism is a good thing. It can, you know, encourage all sorts of virtues, civic virtues. It can make us come together as people and, you know, share values and ideals and work towards the greater good. But he wanted to emphasise how patriotism and the love for our country has to be tempered by reason and rationality, and it has to be tempered ultimately by the universal good. So for Price, he saw the world as a global citizen. You know, that's part of the national curriculum as well. With the Welsh Baccalaureate, there's an emphasis on global citizenship. Price, one of the greatest global citizens there's been, you know, because he would project and discuss these ideals, always with a view to what's the best for the world community. And that really comes across in his later work, side by side, actually, with quite a bit of discussion about what that ideal community should look like, how we should operate as a political community. And he puts emphasis on values, as you'd expect, you know, good non-conformist minister, virtue, knowledge, truth. And these are the qualities that he saw as the basis for democratic society. And what he also encouraged as well was a really, I think, energetic sort of idea of what the citizen should be. So, you know, if we think typically about how we're told to behave as citizens, there's this idea that we should vote, but, you know, in a sense, we vote every now and again, and then we pass on our responsibilities to politicians, and they do the work for us. And what Price is really wanting to emphasise is, look, we can change society as the community, as people. We shouldn't be sort of sitting down and resting on our laurels or believing that we can't change the world, but actually we should, as best we can, be involved in shaping the society, and also, you know, ensuring that we insist on the best standards of our politicians. So I think all those messages, particularly in this day and age, without wanting to, you know, say too much or to, you know, cast too many aspersions, those values, you know, of decency, of a nationalism that is patriotic but it's not chauvinistic, the idea of a universal good where we need to cooperate globally, especially with obviously the looming climate crisis, all those values are there with Price, and, you know, they're still incredibly valuable and important, especially I think for us in Wales and the sort of political, social traditions we have.
Well, for a difficult question, it was rather a good answer.
Oh, thank you.
I'm keeping an eye on the clock because actually we've covered the three areas I mentioned, albeit in a concise way, and he was commendably concise in the way that he sort of dovetailed lots of themes within those answers. So I think I'd better wrap it up there, because I think we've covered those big themes, and Huw's answered the questions I felt in a... I don't want him to get too big-headed, but actually I thought he did it pretty well, yeah. The themes are ones which I'd like us all to take away with us, really, to think about Price as a big Welshman, to think about Price as a big figure on a global stage, the boy from Tynton, and to think about Price not as somebody who belongs to 3 centuries ago. This is the crucial thing. He belongs to us today, and his legacy is a very valuable one for us today. It's not outmoded, most of it. It's still relevant, and it's worth us holding on to, and it's worth us sharing with new generations. can I just say that it's a great privilege to talk to Huw, because he's an expert in the field, and as you've been able to tell, is a very eloquent exponent as well of the Price legacy. So thank you very much indeed. Do you have a mouth?